Here's where Feynman's genius slices through the noise like a laser. While almost everyone else surrendered to the comfort of exposure, listening to lectures, highlighting textbooks, watching endless videos, Feynman treated knowledge like a mechanic treats an engine, something to be taken apart, inspected, rebuilt, and only then trusted to run. He understood that passively absorbing information is like standing outside a glass window watching someone assemble a puzzle. You see the shapes, maybe even memorize some patterns, but your hands never touch the pieces. You don't feel the friction, the resistance, the satisfaction of forcing two parts to lock. Feynman's biographers tell the story of his early days at Princeton. While other students took pride in how many books they'd skimmed, Feynman would shut himself in his dorm room, close every book, and ask, "Could I teach this to a beginner using only first principles and plain language?" If the answer was no, he'd rip the idea apart until it made sense, until he could rebuild it from scratch. He wasn't satisfied with reciting definitions. He wanted to see the machinery behind the concept. Imagine understanding as a bridge. Most people paint the bridge, memorize its color, maybe brag about how beautiful it looks from a distance. Feynman? He wanted to know why the bridge stands. What happens if you remove a beam, or if the wind blows too hard? He'd rather have a small, sturdy bridge of understanding than a sprawling, ornate one built on sand. He'd test the structure, shake it, even try to break it, because only then do you know what's real and what's decoration. But here's the mistake almost everyone makes. We confuse the ability to recall words with the ability to manipulate reality. Feynman called this the difference between knowing the name of something and knowing something. If you only memorize, you're an actor reciting lines in a language you don't speak. If you understand, you're the playwright. You can improvise, adapt, and create. You can take the idea apart, flip it upside down, and explain it to a child or a Nobel laureate without losing your grip on the core truth. Let's make this even more visual. Picture a magician who learns every spell by rote, memorizing the incantations but never understanding the source of the magic. When the script changes or the wand breaks, he's lost. But the real wizard, the Feynman type, knows the principles behind the magic. He can invent new spells, fix broken wands, or conjure solutions when the rules shift. That's the difference between surface and substance, between imitation and mastery. Feynman's approach wasn't just about humility, it was about intellectual survival. He saw that the world doesn't reward those who can parrot back information. The world rewards those who can solve problems when the textbook is gone, when the situation is new, when the variables change. That's why he was relentless in his pursuit of first principles, those bedrock truths you can always return to, no matter how complex the problem becomes. So the question Feynman posed, one that most never dare to ask, is this. If you stripped away the textbook, could you reconstruct the idea with nothing but logic and the raw facts? If not, you're not learning. You're decorating your ignorance. And that, Feynman believed, is the most dangerous illusion in all of education. If you want to join the minority who studies for understanding, not for the test, subscribe now. But here's where Feynman's genius slices right through the fog. He never confused exposure with mastery. For him, watching a lecture or reading a chapter without wrestling with the ideas was as pointless as staring at the blueprints of a bicycle and expecting to ride it. You can look at the gears and the frame all day, but until you actually hop on and wobble down the street, you haven't learned anything about balance or movement. Feynman knew this instinctively, and it drove his colleagues nuts. There's a famous story. In the physics lounge, someone would mention a new theory. Everyone else would nod in agreement, pretending they understood, eager to look smart. Feynman would break the silence. "Wait, can you explain it to me as if I'm a freshman?" Suddenly, the room would freeze. The experts would stumble. Why? Because they'd memorized the names, but not the mechanics. They'd been exposed, not transformed. For Feynman, knowledge wasn't a trophy you kept on a shelf. It was a tool, a wrench you could grab, twist, and apply. If you couldn't take a concept apart, rebuild it in your own words, and use it to solve a new problem. You didn't own it. The rest was just academic window dressing. Let's make this even more vivid. Imagine you're in a dark room and someone hands you a flashlight. If you just wave it around, you'll see shapes and outlines, but you won't really know what's in the room. Feynman, on the other hand, would crawl on his hands and knees, shining the light into every corner, picking up objects, turning them over, asking, "What is this? How does it work? What happens if I drop it?" He wasn't satisfied with shadows. He wanted to feel the weight of things in his hands. That's the difference between passive exposure and active engagement. Think about how you approach learning. Do you treat information like a museum exhibit, admiring it from a safe distance, never touching? Or do you treat it like clay, kneading it, shaping it, breaking and remolding until the shape is truly yours? Feynman's mind was a workshop, not a showroom. He didn't care about looking smart. He cared about being able to do something with what he knew. But here's the error everyone makes. We assume that if we can recite the definition or recognize the formula, we've mastered it. This is the mental mirage, the illusion of competence. Feynman called this knowing the name of something versus knowing the thing itself. You're not fooling anyone but yourself, and your brain knows it too. That's why, when the exam or real-life challenge appears, your memory evaporates like morning dew. Here's another analogy. Imagine you're learning to swim by reading about swimming. You memorize the strokes, the breathing techniques, the physics of buoyancy. But when you jump in the water for the first time, your body panics. The water is cold, your muscles tense, and suddenly all that theory dissolves. Feynman understood that real learning happens when you're in the water, splashing, swallowing a bit, struggling to stay afloat. The discomfort is not a sign of failure. It's the birthplace of understanding. So how did Feynman break this cycle? That's where the method gets brutally real. And it's nothing like what you were taught in school. He didn't just want to know about the world. He wanted to interact with it, to test his understanding against reality, to be proven wrong, and then build back stronger. That's the Feynman lens. Relentless curiosity, zero tolerance for pretense, and a hunger for the kind of knowledge you can actually use. But most people never get there. They're stuck in the echo chamber of passive learning, mistaking familiarity for understanding. Feynman's approach was a declaration of war against that comfort zone. And if you want to learn like he did, you have to be willing to get your hands dirty, to risk embarrassment, to ask the dumb questions everyone else is too proud to voice. That's the only way to break through the illusion and start seeing the world as it really is. Here's the root of your frustration. Your brain is wired to crave efficiency and minimize pain. It's a survival mechanism, millions of years old, that pushes you toward anything that feels familiar, comfortable, and effortless. When you sit through a lecture, highlight a textbook, or rewatch a video, your mind rewards you with a little shot of dopamine. See, you recognize this. You must understand it. But this is a neurological mirage. Imagine your brain as a river that's always looking for the path of least resistance. Passive learning is like floating downstream. It's smooth, easy, and deceptively reassuring. But real understanding? That's forging a new channel through solid rock. It's strenuous, it's slow, it's uncomfortable. And that discomfort is the biological signal that you're actually changing the structure of your mind. Feynman understood this at an intuitive level. He didn't trust the feeling of, "I get it," unless he could break an idea apart, reassemble it in his own words, and explain it to someone else, preferably a child. That's not just a quirky preference. It's a hack for outsmarting your own biology. When you force yourself to reconstruct knowledge from scratch, you trigger brain regions responsible for deep encoding and conceptual integration, rather than just pattern recognition. But here's the error everyone makes. You interpret struggle as failure rather than as the proof of progress. The educational system taught you that if something is hard, you're not smart enough. Feynman would laugh at that. He saw confusion as the starting pistol, not the finish line. Let's get even more concrete. Think about the last time you tried to solve a tough problem and hit a wall. Did you immediately reach for the answer key, or did you sit with the discomfort? Most people run from that friction, but that friction is the heat that forges new neural pathways. It's like lifting weights. If you're not straining, your muscles aren't growing. The same is true for your mind. Every time you resist the urge to look up the answer and instead wrestle with the idea, draw diagrams, talk it out loud, teach it to an imaginary student, you're literally sculpting your brain. Synapses are firing, connections are being rewired. That's not just poetic, it's measurable on a brain scan. Here's another analogy. Imagine you're learning to ride a bike. Watching videos or reading about balance gives you the illusion of competence. But the first time you get on the bike, you wobble, you fall, you feel awkward. That's the moment your brain is forced to recalibrate, to build the circuitry for real skill. Synapses are firing, connections are being rewired. That's not just poetic, it's measurable on a brain scan. Here's another analogy. Imagine you're learning to ride a bike. Watching videos or reading about balance gives you the illusion of competence. But the first time you get on the bike, you wobble, you fall, you feel awkward. That's the moment your brain is forced to recalibrate, to build the circuitry for real skill. The same principle applies to any intellectual pursuit. If you're not falling off the bike, you're not learning to ride. So the next time you feel lost or frustrated, recognize it for what it is. The signpost that you're finally on the right path. Feynman didn't run from that feeling. He chased it, because he knew that on the other side was real understanding. The discomfort isn't a bug in the system, it's the core mechanism of learning. If you want to escape the biological trap, you have to stop mistaking ease for mastery. You have to seek out the struggle, embrace the confusion, and trust that the pain of not knowing is the birthplace of genuine knowledge. Here's where Feynman's genius slices through centuries of confusion like a scalpel. He understood that most people, even those with impressive diplomas, confuse naming something with understanding it. This is the fundamental principle that separates real learning from the theater of learning. Let's make this painfully clear. If you can only recite the name of a process, a law, or a concept, you're not a scientist. You're a parrot. Picture this. You're staring at a complex machine, say an old mechanical watch. You can point at the gears and springs, recite their names, escapement, balance wheel, mainspring. You might even know which gear turns which. But if someone asks you, how does this machine actually keep time? Can you build the answer from scratch, or do you just repeat what you've heard? Feynman called this the difference between knowing the name of something and knowing the thing itself. It's the difference between reading the label on a locked box and actually opening it to see what's inside. Your brain, by default, is lazy. It loves shortcuts. It rewards you with a little dopamine hit every time you recognize a term, recall a definition, or fill in the blank on a test. It feels good, safe, effortless. But it's an optical illusion. You're not learning. You're collecting labels. It's as if you're putting sticky notes on the outside of a locked box, never bothering to figure out what's inside. That's why when real life asks you to use that knowledge, you freeze. The box is empty. Let's use another analogy. Imagine you're building a bridge across a river. Memorizing the names of the materials is like stacking bricks on the riverbank. You can build a tall, impressive pile, but it doesn't get you across. Understanding, though, is when you actually connect those bricks, forming a structure that can carry your weight when you need to cross. Without that, your knowledge collapses the moment it's tested. Feynman's principle is brutally simple, and yet almost nobody lives by it. Why? Because the education system and your own mind conspire to make you feel smart for shallow reasons. You get praised for reciting, not for reasoning. You get rewarded for speed, not depth. But here's the catch. Your brain doesn't build the deep, interlocking neural patterns of true understanding unless you reconstruct the idea from its basic parts. If you only rehearse the surface, you never build the machinery underneath. Feynman's test was unforgiving. If you can't explain an idea in your own words, or better, teach it to a child, then you do not understand it. Full stop. This isn't just philosophy, it's neurobiology. When you struggle to explain, your brain is forced to confront the gaps, to link concepts, to build real connections. That's when learning happens. The pain of not knowing is the birthplace of genuine knowledge. But here's the mistake everyone makes. You think that because you can repeat, you can reason. Feynman knew better, and so can you. This is the dividing line between intellectual illusion and mastery. If you want to cross it, you have to stop stacking bricks and start building bridges. You have to open the box, not just label it. And that's where the real adventure begins. So, how do you actually open the box? How do you move from stacking labels to building bridges of real understanding? Here's where Feynman's practical genius becomes your roadmap. Imagine you're staring at a complex circuit diagram or a tangled web of economic theory. Most people trace the lines, nod along, and, if pressed, parrot the terms: resistor, capacitor, fiscal policy, equilibrium. But this is like looking at the outside of a locked safe and convincing yourself you know what's inside. Feynman's method shatters this false confidence. He'd grab a blank sheet of paper and force himself to write out the concept, not in jargon, but as if teaching it to a child or a bartender, someone who doesn't care for technical posturing. Can you explain a photon not as a blurry cloud of equations, but as a little bullet of light, like marbles bouncing in a box? That's the acid test. Here's your experiment. Pick the next thing you want to learn: a chemical reaction, a historical event, a mathematical theorem. Now, close all your tabs. No textbooks, no videos. Take a sheet and write the concept down as if you were telling a curious 12-year-old. Where do you stumble? Where does your mind reach for empty words instead of real explanations? That's the exposed wire. You've just found the gap in your bridge. See, Feynman called this the process of finding the edge of your knowledge. It's like mapping a dark room with a flashlight. You don't discover the room by memorizing what's supposed to be there. You bump into the furniture, trip over the unknown, and only then do you begin to see the outline of the real territory. But here's what almost no one dares to do: sit with that discomfort. Most people double down on memorization, patch the gaps with more jargon, and retreat from the edge. But here's what almost no one dares to do: sit with that discomfort. Feynman would grin at the confusion and poke at it until he could rebuild the idea from scratch. That's the technique. Not just knowing the name, but knowing the nature. Not fearing the gaps, but hunting them, because every exposed gap is a chance to actually learn. Let's make this even more concrete. Imagine you're learning about gravity. You could memorize Newton's law, recite the formula, and feel clever. But Feynman would ask, what does gravity actually do? Can you picture two planets pulling on each other like invisible hands stretching a rubber sheet? Can you explain why astronauts float in orbit, not because there's no gravity, but because they're in free fall, perpetually missing the Earth? If you can turn the abstract into a mental movie, you're not just stacking facts, you're animating them. Now, the technique sounds simple. Write it down in plain words, spot the gaps, go back to the source, and refine. But the act of wrestling with your own ignorance isn't just a trick. It's the fundamental rewiring your brain needs to transform data into understanding. Every failed attempt to explain is a spark that forges a new connection. That's the difference between stacking facts and building a living model inside your mind. But here's the catch. This process is uncomfortable. It's slow. It exposes your ignorance. And that's exactly why it works. If you want to learn like Feynman, you have to be willing to look foolish, to admit what you don't know, and to keep pushing until the concept clicks, not just in your memory, but in your bones. That's how you open the box, and that's how you build the bridge from knowing to understanding. But here's where almost everyone stumbles, even after knowing the path. Why? Because your mind is wired to avoid discomfort. When you hit the wall of not knowing, your brain screams for escape. It's like standing in a cold shower. You know it's good for you, but every cell wants out. This is the hidden obstacle, the psychological gravity that pulls you back toward passive comfort. Think about it. Have you ever noticed how, the moment you reach a tough part in a textbook or a lecture, your attention drifts? You check your phone, you reread the same sentence, maybe even convince yourself that you kinda get it. That's not a coincidence. That's your ego, your mind's inner politician working overtime to protect you from the sting of intellectual humility. Feynman used to say, the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. Let's make this painfully clear with a visual analogy. Imagine your mind as a dark room. The areas you've mastered are lit up, familiar, comforting. But the unknown? That's the shadowy corner, the place your eyes instinctively avoid. Every time you step toward that shadow, every time you admit, I do not understand this, you're fighting an evolutionary urge to retreat. But if you never step into the dark, you never light up new territory. Most people spend their lives rearranging the furniture in the lit part of the room, never daring to expand the light itself. But here's the error everyone makes. They mistake comfort for competence. You might feel smart because you recognize the words or recall the formula, but that's just the glow from the familiar lamp. Real understanding means you can walk into the dark, bump into the unknown, and slowly, painfully wire up a new light. That's the only way the room grows. And the ego hates this. It whispers, you should already know this, or if you ask, they'll think you're stupid. So you nod along in class, you highlight the textbook, you memorize definitions, anything to avoid the embarrassment of ignorance. But Feynman's genius was his total lack of shame in saying, I don't get it, explain it to me like I'm a child. He knew that every moment spent pretending was a moment stolen from real learning. Here's another analogy. Imagine you're building a bridge across a river. The traditional student piles up planks on one side, facts, formulas, buzzwords, hoping that, eventually, the bridge will reach the other bank. But Feynman's way is different. He tests every plank, every support. If something doesn't fit, he tears it out and starts over. It's slower, messier, but when he finally walks across, the bridge holds. Most people, terrified of the gaps, just throw more planks on the pile and pray. This is the paradox Feynman understood. The more you protect your ego, the less you learn. Intellectual laziness isn't just about not working hard. It's about not being brutally honest with yourself. If you want to transform your learning, you have to become the kind of person who says, again and again, I don't know. That's where the real shift begins. The courage to look foolish is the price of admission to real understanding. And the moment you embrace that vulnerability, you start to see the world not as a set of facts to memorize, but as a landscape to explore, one shadow at a time. But here's where most people falter, even after hearing all this. There's a deeply rooted fear that if you drop the armor, if you admit the gaps in your knowledge, you'll be lost in the dark. But Feynman would tell you, ignorance isn't a void, it's a frontier. Imagine you're in a pitch-black cave holding a lantern. Every time you admit, I don't know, you're not shrinking your world, you're lighting up a new corner. The cave grows, not because darkness wins, but because your curiosity pushes the boundaries outward. This is the mental model Feynman lived by. He didn't see himself as a container to be filled with facts. He saw himself as an explorer, mapping out the edges of the unknown. The ego wants to stay in the lit-up circle of what you already know. But every real breakthrough in your understanding happens the moment you're willing to step outside that circle. That's why Feynman's notebooks were filled with questions, not just answers. He used ignorance as a tool, not a weakness. Let's make this concrete. Think of learning like climbing a mountain at night. The summit, the place of real mastery, is hidden in the darkness. Most people cling to the little campfire of what's familiar, warming themselves with memorized definitions and textbook formulas. But Feynman? He'd strap on his headlamp, pick a direction, and start climbing, mistakes, wrong turns, and all. Every misstep was a signal. Here's where I don't understand yet. Here's where I need to look closer. Instead of fearing the dark, he was obsessed with mapping it. But here's the twist that almost everyone misses. The more you illuminate, the bigger the cave becomes. The more you learn, the more you realize what you don't know. This can feel overwhelming, even paralyzing. Most people retreat at this point, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of their ignorance. But Feynman leaned in. He saw that the expanding frontier was a sign of progress, not failure. If your questions are multiplying, you're doing it right. If your confidence is shrinking as your understanding grows, you're on the path of real mastery. Let's use another analogy. Imagine you're drawing a map of an island. At first, your map is just a tiny circle, the patch of sand where you landed. As you explore, you sketch out the coastline, the forests, the mountains. But every new feature you discover hints at more beyond the horizon. The map never feels finished. That's what learning is supposed to feel like, a perpetual expansion, a growing sense of wonder and humility. Feynman's brilliance was that he never mistook the map for the territory. He knew that every answer was just a stepping stone to a better question. So, next time you're tempted to hide in the comfort of what you already know, catch yourself. Ask, am I protecting my ego, or am I expanding my map of the unknown? Feynman's genius wasn't just in his answers, it was in the relentless honesty of his questions. If you want to learn like Feynman, trade your armor for a lantern. The adventure only begins when you're brave enough to light up the next patch of shadow. And remember, the size of your ignorance is not a measure of your failure, but the true proof that you are, in fact, learning. But here's the final epiphany, the real Feynman shift that rewires how you approach learning forever. You're not meant to be a passive receiver of facts. You're not a storage device for other people's answers. Your mind is a laboratory, not a museum. Feynman didn't just accept the world as it was presented, he poked, prodded, and turned every idea upside down to see what would fall out. If you want to make this shift, you need a new model. Imagine your mind as a vast, dark cave, with only a thin beam of light in your hand. Every time you ask a real question, every time you dare to say, I don't know, you swing that light into a new corner. You reveal forms and connections that no textbook could ever hand to you fully assembled. Think of learning not as stacking up bricks of information, but as mapping out an unknown landscape. The old method, the myth, tells you to collect more bricks and build your wall higher. But Feynman's way is to take those bricks, break them apart, see what's inside, and use them to build bridges over the gaps in your understanding. Sometimes you'll smash a brick and find it's hollow. It was just a label, a name, a memorized phrase with no real substance inside. Sometimes you'll find a seed, an idea that grows into a whole new branch of insight if you nurture it with genuine curiosity. This is why Feynman's notebooks weren't just filled with answers, but with experiments, mental models, diagrams, wild guesses, and corrections. He knew that every mistake was a data point, every confusion a clue. The map of your ignorance is the most precious thing you own, because it shows you exactly where to shine your light next. But here's the twist that most people miss. The more you illuminate, the more you realize how much darkness remains. This isn't a flaw in your intelligence, it's the signature of real progress. Feynman called this the joy of finding things out. He didn't fear the unknown, he was addicted to it. The discomfort you feel when you don't know is the very fuel that drives discovery. If you numb that discomfort with memorization, you kill the engine before it even starts. So, here's your new mental model. Don't measure your learning by how much you can recite. Measure it by how much of your own cave you've illuminated. The more questions you ask, real, risky questions, the more territory you claim from the darkness. And every time you push your lantern forward, you're not just learning physics or history or language, you're learning how to learn. That's the engine Feynman built, and it's yours to ignite. If this video spun a new gear in your mind, the next one will set the whole engine turning. Subscribe for the next Feynman Mindshift. But only do it if you're ready to stop pretending, to stop hiding behind the comfort of knowing, and to start the real adventure, mapping the unknown, one honest question at a time. The world doesn't need more people who can recite answers. It needs more explorers, people brave enough to admit what they don't know and relentless enough to chase the light anyway. That's the Feynman way. That's the mind shift.